All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be back.
So today we're tackling a case that I think, it kind of blew my mind when I first read about it.
Yeah, this one's pretty wild.
And, it might seem like a super specific situation, but it really brings up these huge questions.
Right, about consent, marriage, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like the kind of stuff that anyone who's ever been in a relationship or thinking about getting married should really pay attention to.
It's definitely, and it's especially relevant, I think, for younger people, like those who are just starting to think about what they want in a long-term relationship.
Totally, because this case is all about a French woman. She's identified as Mrs. H.W. in the court documents.
Right, to protect her privacy.
Exactly, yeah, and she basically won this huge ruling from the European Court of Human Rights.
Landmark ruling, really.
Yeah, after a decade-long legal battle. Can you believe that?
It's incredible, isn't it, that she kept fighting for so long.
It really is.
Yeah.
And well, the thing is, the whole thing started because French courts basically penalized her for refusing to have sex with her husband.
Yeah, and it's easy to just be like, what? How is that even possible?
Right, how could that even be a thing? But the fact that it happened means we really got to dig into this.
Absolutely. We need to understand how something like this could happen and what it means for the future,
Okay, so let's rewind a bit, way back to 1984.
Okay, back when shoulder pads were all the rage.
Uh-huh, right. So Mrs. H.W. and her husband, they get married that year, and then they go on to have 4 kids.
And Mrs. H.W. becomes the primary caregiver, especially for their daughter who has a disability.
So, already we're seeing a lot of commitment and sacrifice on her part, right?
Sure, for sure. It sounds like she was really dedicated to her family.
Yeah, absolutely. But sadly, things start to go downhill in their relationship.
And not just a little downhill. It sounds like things got pretty bad.
Yeah, in 2002, the husband starts getting physically and verbally abusive towards her.
Which is, just horrific.
Totally. And it's after this that Mrs. H.W., understandably, decides to stop having sexual relations with her husband.
Which is completely her right.
Totally. But fast forward to 2012, and things get, kind of crazy.
Yeah, this is where the case really starts to get interesting, right?
So in 2012, Mrs. H.W. files for divorce.
Which, after all she'd been through, seems pretty reasonable.
Totally. But get this. The French courts actually faulted her for the breakdown of the marriage.
Because she wouldn't have sex with him.
Yeah, they cited this concept of marital duty.
Which, basically means they were operating under this assumption that once you're married, you've given ongoing consent to sex no matter what.
It's like they thought saying I do means you've signed away your right to say no later on, which is, so messed up.
Right. It completely ignores the idea that someone's feelings and desires can change, especially in a situation like this where there's abuse involved.
Exactly. But thankfully, Ms. H.W. wasn't having any of it.
I mean, after years of this treatment, who could blame her?
Totally. So she appeals this ruling all the way to France's highest court.
Which is, not an easy thing to do.
No, not at all. But sadly, they dismiss her appeal too.
So what does she do? She takes it even higher, to the European Court of Human Rights.
That's right. In 2021, her case lands in the ECHR's lap, and, they ended up making a pretty big statement with their ruling.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting, especially for anyone listening who's thinking about getting married or is already in a long-term relationship.
So what did the ECHR actually say? Break it down for us.
Okay, so they ruled that France had violated Mrs. H.W.'s right to a private and family life.
Okay, but what does that even mean in this context?
Well, they basically said that assuming ongoing consent to sex just because 2 people are married totally disregards individual autonomy.
Just because you say I do doesn't mean you're saying yes to sex for the rest of your life.
Exactly. And they also pointed out that this kind of thinking fails to recognize that dynamics within a marriage can change over time.
People grow and change and relationships evolve.
Right. And the law needs to acknowledge that.
And that brings us to the real meat of this whole thing, right?
The implications of this ruling are pretty huge.
Okay, so what does this mean for people getting married in the future? How does this change things legally?
Well, the ECHR based its decision on Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Okay.
And that article specifically safeguards the right to a private and family life.
Right. I've heard of that, but what's that got to do with anything?
Well, essentially, it means that you have the right to make your own personal decisions, and that includes decisions about your own body and sexual relationships.
Okay, so that makes sense, but how does that apply to marriage specifically?
It means that even within a marriage, you still have those rights.
So you can't just assume consent just because two people are married.
Right. The state can't interfere in those personal decisions even within a marriage.
Wow, that's just like a pretty big shift in thinking, isn't it?
Definitely. And it's a shift that could have a ripple effect on legal systems around the world.
Like, could this ruling be used to challenge similar laws in other countries?
Potentially, yes. And it could also encourage countries to reevaluate how they approach marital consent and, maybe even lead to more explicit legal recognition of marital rape.
Whoa, that's a heavy one. But yeah, if consent is so important even within marriage, then wouldn't non-consensual sex within marriage have to be treated as a crime?
Exactly, just like it is outside of marriage.
Wow, it's crazy to think that this whole case, which started with a woman nearing 70, could end up changing the legal landscape for younger generations and how they view relationships.
It's pretty mind-blowing, right? This case is like a wake-up call.
Totally. So, like, if saying I do doesn't mean you're automatically saying yes to sex whenever, then how do couples, especially younger couples, figure out those expectations and communicate about intimacy and consent in their relationships?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think this ruling is going to force those conversations to happen more openly and honestly.
Like, maybe it'll even change what couples talk about in premarital counseling or, like, the kinds of agreements they make.
Yeah, it could lead to people being much more upfront about their boundaries and expectations around sex and intimacy.
Which is, like, super important. Right.
Absolutely. It's not just about avoiding legal trouble. It's about building healthy relationships based on mutual respect and understanding.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that one. This is about so much more than just the law.
Right. This case has sparked a crucial conversation about consent, communication, and what it really means to be in a committed relationship.
Well said. And, for anyone listening who's just starting out on their own relationship journey, remember, this case has set a powerful precedent.
It's a reminder that your individual rights and autonomy matter, even within a marriage.
Consent matters, communication is key, and those are things you should never be afraid to talk about.
Couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, that's our deep dive for today. Keep those conversations going, and we'll catch you next time.
See you then.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.